What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Now that Cheaper by the Dozen 2022 is out and I've reviewed each of the other movies, it's time to rank all 5 Cheaper by the Dozen films from worst to best. So let me know in the comments what your ranking of the Cheaper by the Dozen movies are. As always, this is just my list and not a definitive ranking. Also, make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these videos, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie related content on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's jump into the list. In last place is Cheaper by the Dozen 2, the second Steve Martin film that essentially took a more of the same approach, repeating a lot of the same shtick from the first film, though it doubled down on arguably the worst parts of it. This is probably the most mean-spirited of all these films, especially considering Steve Martin, who was the most likable part of the first movie, is the one being increasingly petty here, and he tends to be pretty open about it. Plus, it places an even heavier emphasis on comedic pratfalls and over-the-top slapstick that feels incredibly forced, and it moves from scene to scene in a noticeably choppy and rushed manner. And I know, with both of the Steve Martin films, I'm going to get the excuse of, well, it's a kid's movie, what do you expect? But I mean, just because something's a kid's movie or a family-friendly movie doesn't give it a pass for poor writing, and that goes for any type of movie from any genre, really. But here we see things like characters will put up this big argument over something and they make a huge stink about it, but they change their mind after like one line of dialogue in the very same scene. A lot of how this movie's structured plays out in that same fashion, which makes it feel very disjointed, especially as this is in conjunction with it trying to force in these ridiculous gags that just don't work. Now, there's still a little bit of charm to it, and I do think Steve Martin, Eugene Levy, and some of the other cast members do what they can with the material, and I think it can entertain younger audiences as some mindless entertainment, but that's about it. At number 4 is Cheaper by the Dozen 2003, probably the most seen of all these films, though unfortunately it's one that doesn't hold up all that well. While most of the older cast, in particular Steve Martin and Bonnie Hunt, are all charming, and there's the occasional inspired moment with some surprisingly clever banter, the over-reliance on slapstick gags and pratfalls winds up not working all that much. Like the sequel, most of the humor feels mean-spirited in nature, with the younger kids feeling completely unlikable at times for the amount of vindictive destruction they cause. So all that really happens is you feel bad for all the other characters that get caught in the crossfires rather than finding the situations funny. While all the physical gags give it the feel of being this wild ride, this is really nothing more than a generic kids comedy from the 2000s, a lot of which took on a similar approach in their humor. Now, while we don't get as many kids movies like that these days, similar to its sequel, this might still entertain younger audiences. But also like the sequel, I can't see anyone outside of that target audience getting much out of this. At number 3 is the latest film, Cheaper by the Dozen 2022, which takes on a much more down-to-earth tone than the Martin films, where most of the misadventures are amusing but ultimately harmless. There's a cheery, wholesome vibe to it that kids will certainly appreciate, and there's a charm to it, especially thanks to Zach Braff and Gabrielle Union, who managed to carry this for a good chunk of the runtime. That being said, while it wasn't the most clever movie to begin with, it does ultimately devolve a bit too much into being riddled with cliches in its final act, especially retreading some similar plot points to the Martin films. And in its attempts at trying to be emotional, it ultimately comes off as a bit too corny. So it doesn't quite stick the landing, unfortunately. While not necessarily a bad movie, and I think there's a better chance of it being fun for the whole family as opposed to the Martin films, I wouldn't say it's guaranteed, and I still think there may only be so much appeal beyond its target audience, that being younger kids. At number 2 is Bells on Their Toes, the sequel to the original 1950 film, both of which are based on true stories. And of all the films on this list, this is arguably the one with the most dramatic weight of them all, as its primary focus is how this family is reeling from a major death, and we see them struggle to pick up the pieces. And as a result, I'd say this is the most thematically strong of the bunch, though it's also not without its humor and charm, even if there wasn't always a consistency in the way in which it was expressed. I think due to the clearly dated sitcom-style humor at times, its shifts from its more dramatic moments to comedic moments wouldn't feel the smoothest, and the absence of a particular cast member from the first film can clearly be felt, especially in its sometimes hit-and-miss attempts at humor. So I think because it can feel dated, I think its biggest appeal will mainly be with those who enjoy these older films, but I still think it's a good time overall, When things focus more on the older daughters and their romances as they realize what it truly means to grow up and move on, I think that's where this film found a much better sense of focus, and it allowed it to end on a truly strong note, making for an ultimately heartwarming story. But in first place is the original 1950 Cheaper by the Dozen, a charming, whimsical film that serves as a loving tribute to this eccentric but deeply caring father played by Clifton Webb. It has a loose narrative about it, with a vignette-like structure where conflicts are generally resolved as quickly as they're brought up, and in some ways, it reminded me of something akin to an extended episode of a 1950s sitcom. So like Bells on Their Toes, it can feel noticeably dated at times, especially in its sense of humor, but it's still generally pretty amusing, especially thanks to the larger-than-life performance by Webb, who steals the show whenever he's on screen. And while like Bells on Their Toes, I think the ones who will appreciate this the most will be those who love films from this time period, it's still a heartwarming, funny, and charming film, and it comes in as my number one of the Cheaper by the Dozen movies. But in the meantime, let me know, what's your ranking of the Cheaper by the Dozen films? Did you agree with this list at all? Did you disagree with it? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.